Bones, books, and bell jars. What a great way to summon up the collection that we have here at the Mütter Museum and our Historical Medical Library. But as you see, it's also the title of a book. This is a splendid book of photographs, and the photographs go on exhibit here at the Mütter Museum today. The photographer behind this is Andrea Baldeck, MD, who's my guest today. Now, her work as a photographer goes far and wide, to the peoples of the Himalayas, to the old culture of the sea by the eastern shore of Virginia, and everything in between. Welcome to No Bones About It. I'm your host, Robert Hicks. Yeah, welcome to No Bones About It. Well, we're sure excited, and behind us we have some of the photographs that are in this book and on exhibit today. This project goes back a little ways. Why did you do this project? And what would you like people to get from looking at these photographs?
I've been captivated by the contents of the College of Physicians for a long time, specifically the Mütter Museum and the Historical Library, and remember studying here occasionally when I was a medical student. But it wasn't until I became a fellow and had the opportunity to get to know you and the CEO, George Woolreich, a bit better, that I had real entree into the collections behind the scenes. And I was fascinated by the trove of wonders that aren't on exhibit, and wanted a way to bring them to light, literally, and to share with people the riches that are part of the collection here, and to illustrate the history of medicine in a way that's very immediate, very visual, and perhaps a bit unusual.
Now, you have not only selected photography as the medium for this vision, but a very specific kind of photography. It's black and white, and it's film.
Yes.
All of your photographic projects here and elsewhere follow this. What can film, black and white, show our visitors that might enhance their appreciation or allow them to see things in a new way?
I like to work in black and white because it is an abstraction from reality, and of course a photograph is already just a two-dimensional version of three-dimensional reality. But when you subtract the color, you involve the viewer in a different way, because they're drawn to the composition, the contours, the way the light falls. Sometimes they're attracted to the emotional content of the photograph in a way that is often less experienced with color, because color is marvelous and we live in a very colorful world, but a lot of color photography is just about color itself. And I have wanted to get people involved more in the content, the subject matter, and the relationships between the pieces in each composition. And I work in film because I love it. It is not as quick or simple or transmissible as digital, but film has some magic to it, and I think that may have to do with the fact that it's silver crystals embedded in the emulsion of the film itself, and silver embedded in the emulsion of the printing paper, so that when you create an image, you're working with sort of distilled light, and it's a different effect than one gets with digital photography, which in the prints is either pigment or ink on paper, and there's just a different visual feel. And I happen to like the velvety blacks and the beautiful contrast that can be obtained using film.
Well, it's interesting that you express it that way, because my impression is many of these are actually very tactile. It's almost as if the viewer can reach in and caress the things. And that's the sensation it sort of evokes. Not to displace them or ruin them or get them out of the way, but to feel them and to apply the sensation of touch in a way that you might not otherwise consider. And yet it's a photograph.
That's the hoped for response, because so many of these components of the photographs have remarkable textures to them and details. And when I was handling them and arranging them, I was struck with the quality of the paper and ink in the books, or the heft of the instruments, and of course, when working with some of the specimens in jars, a very sort of reverential feeling toward the contents and the solid matter within.
Well, we've had photographers come here who have been interested in specific specimens or groups of specimens, but it's rare for photographers to explore so widely that they're pulling out very unusual or seldom seen library materials as well. It's almost as if there's a dialogue in some instances where in some of your photographs you have a specimen, a text, instrument, there's a communication there.
Thank you. That was, again, something I deliberately wanted to achieve, and I started out in the library looking for singular books that would sort of anchor the picture in many cases and speak to the era in which it was made and the history of medicine and culture of that era, to try to involve one in feeling the era that is depicted, a way of making sense of all the parts. And the books so often were meant to instruct, enlighten, otherwise document. That pulling in the pieces to complement the book became a sort of a natural experience and helped me to go from library then to storage to try to enhance or complete the picture.
Now, visitors to this exhibit will notice a selection of photographs that have black, almost velvet, or black velvet texture backgrounds. And they're no books, no specimens, but they're instruments, steel medical instruments. And the compositions are very interesting. In some cases, they look like live animals. In other cases, they look architectural. It gives a very different way for people to engage with tools that are, after all, designed to open up and rip apart the human body. Comment on those pictures.
Those tools are both beautiful and disturbing. They're beautiful because they're very well made. They were, in many cases, made in small craftsmen's studios here in Philadelphia. And so they have a very individualistic feel. You can imagine that a particular surgeon or obstetrician ordered these, made for his or her practice. So they have this beauty in themselves of being functional and abstract and just very curious. They engage the mind and the vision. On the other hand, you look at these and think, lovely, but I would not want to be on the receiving end of most of these tools, because they clearly were made for procedures that produced pain, often in an era when there was no anesthesia. And they were also in use in the era before antibiotics, so that practice of the day might be to wipe off the blood after the surgical procedure was finished and replace that beautifully machined tool in a velvet box. And there would be no thought of sterilization. So it's a very mixed set of sensations that you get looking at these tools, and it invokes respect, appreciation, awe, and a little fear.
All of the above. Now, readers of your book will see these photographs reproduced to a very high standard, but they will see something in the book they won't see in the exhibit, and that is you have organized the photographs in the book by the location of the thing in the museum or in the stacks, wherever it happens to be. So the book comes across as a bit of a rummage through some seldom visited spaces.
Yes.
Comment on that form of organizing the material.
Well, since the viewer doesn't have the opportunity to go behind the scenes, I wanted to paint a small picture of what it was like to be involved in this process, because I found it very engaging, and it was a time when I got to interact with so much of this material, mostly alone, mostly in quiet, and I had the time to contemplate the books and bones and tools that I was working with. And so, because I think everyone is curious about what lies behind the doors that are closed and off limits, I wanted to introduce the viewer to some of those spaces and where I encountered some of these marvelous bits of subject matter.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. I hope it really piques people's interest to come down and see what this is all about. And of course, they can get the book. But remember, you can come down and see this exhibit. It will be up at least to the end of 2012, and this book is now available. So you can get the book, but there's no excuse for coming down here and seeing the real thing. So do come down. So thank you very much for joining us today on No Bones About It. We look forward to seeing you next time for further explorations of interesting things. So long till next time. When you have held a musical seance, have you ever felt in performance that perhaps some otherworldly thing or essence or spirit has been summoned up for that performance?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it doesn't happen every time, and that's not our intention with it, to talk to the dead. But at one, I have a few, but one that I will mention here is in Canada, violinist Paul Mercer was performing on an old violin, and he didn't tell the audience the history of the violin. And after the show, someone came up to us and said, "Gee, while you were playing that violin, I saw a man standing behind you." And a figure, you know, of a man standing behind you. And it was strange because he was soaking wet. Mm-hmm. And later, and Paul just turned white. And the violin that Paul was playing was one that he had recovered from a man in the 1800s who had drowned in a river, a musician who was killed on the way home from a gig and was drowned in the river. So that violin was soaking wet when it was discovered.
Wow. Amazing moment.
Yeah.